First of all, very warm welcome to you all on this anniversary weekend. In this morning's session, we aim to discuss the past, present and future of studying and teaching the humanities and social sciences, based on our shared experiences at St Hughs. When I say our, I mean yours, not just ours up here. The schedule only allows us 45 minutes, and 5 of those have already gone. But if our discussion is still going strong around 12, I propose continuing for a further 10 minutes or so. Each member of the panel will in turn speak about some aspect of our topic. Then I'll open the discussion for comments, questions, and contributions from you all. We've got a roving microphone, and can I ask you, when you make a contribution or ask a question, it would be helpful if you could just say who you are, subject you studied, and when. Well, you can omit the date if you want. I'm not going to omit my date. I'll introduce the panel, but myself first. I'm Mary Clapinson. I'm chairing the panel. I read history here from 1963 to 6, returned to college as a non-teaching fellow in 1986 when I was head of the manuscript department in the Bodleian, and I retired last year. John Robertson, sitting in the middle, is Professor of the History of Political Thought at Cambridge, having been tutor in modern history here from 1980 to 2010. Liz Robertson is a solicitor with Jones Day in London, studied PPE for a year here and then law from 1982 to 6. And at the far end is Tom Kuhn, who's Castle Fellow and tutor in German here and has been since 1990. Great. Well, I'll start the ball rolling with a light contribution, brief recollections of St Hughs in the 60s. College was, in those days, of course, much smaller. I checked in the university calendar and found that in Michaelmas term 1963, when I came up, there were 18 teaching and research fellows, compared with 69 now. There were 5 lecturers, compared with 28 now. Between 70 to 80 junior members matriculated each year in the 1960s, compared with the between 200 and 220 who come up each year nowadays. Of course, the growth is reflected in our buildings. The mid-60s, in my last year here, we saw the first new building on the site. That is the first new building since the completion of MGA Extension 30 years earlier in 1936. The growth of college buildings since then has been rapid, with Wolfson, Rachel Trickett, and now Maplethorpe building. In the early 60s, I think most of us spent our first year in a college house. We were out in digs in the second year and back in college for the third. So I think there were a few of us, but not many, who had a chance of rooms in college for all our time at St Hughs. But I think the important thing about St Hughs then as now is that it was a friendly college, and was and is a friendly college, and even more important, a stimulating environment for study. Well, what about the studying? Tutorials loomed large, of course. With 3 history fellows at St Hughs in the early 60s, many of us had the majority of our tutorials in college, though I think most of us went to other colleges for some of our teaching. In my case, it was for rigorous tutorials at Lady Margaret Hall. How can I put it? Less rigorous ones at Keble. Ones that I found very difficult to follow at Merton, and very stimulating ones at Balliol. Terms were dominated by the hard grind of writing 2 essays each week, and with the enormous amount of reading, note-taking, and analysis that entailed, it's perhaps not surprising that the majority of my recollections of studying revolve around the libraries, principally College Library and the Radcliffe Camera, rather than around the tutorials themselves. In fact, the smell of the linoleum in the upper camera still takes me back to the 60s. I also remember vividly the daunting experience of having to make my way down Duke Humphrey's library, which then, but perhaps not now, was the holy of holies in the old Bodleian, needing to consult a volume of the Victoria County History in Selden End for an essay that Miss Dickinson had set us on the Civil War in a region of our choice. I don't remember lectures as being anything but a bit tedious, really, with the exception of Richard Southern's, whose gentle Northumbrian accent succeeded, for me at least, in making all his lectures totally engrossing. Nothing in the history syllabus in the 60s involved the use of primary sources until we reached our special subject in our third year. Tutorials on the French Revolution with Richard Cobb introduced me for the first time to the joys of documents, albeit in printed editions and in French. An experience which was a foretaste of a fulfilling career as an archivist and manuscript librarian in the Bodleian. In the course of that career, as a result of developments in local and family history, I taught courses on how to read original documents and how to interpret the evidence they provided. In an interesting progression, I think, of arenas, first in evening classes, WAA classes, then in the university's extramural department, and finally in the history faculty. I think this marks a gradual change in the study of history in the university, so that now all candidates in the Honours School have, as part of their final examinations, to submit a thesis, which includes an investigation of printed or unprinted primary sources, as well as, I like this in the regulations, as well as proper footnotes and a bibliography. A much better introduction, dare I say it, to the study of history than I think we received in the 60s. But anyway, enough of my reminiscences. I'll pass you over to John for more measured reflections.
Well, I thought I wouldn't reminisce so much about my time as a tutor 30 years, but try to talk about a general issue relating to the humanities and the humanities at St. Hugh's, and do that by talking about one of the great, perhaps the fundamental continuity in the history of the college, and that is a disciplinary education. It's something that perhaps doesn't feature as much as it might in Laura Schwartz's admirable history. I don't think it's something she makes a great deal of, so it's perhaps worth raising in this context. That is, from the first, undergraduates at St. Hugh's have studied, and in due course, of course, it didn't happen right away, were prepared for and presented for degrees in disciplines. That is, starting with history, English literature, modern languages, law, PPE, a bit of a hybrid, I'll have another word about that in a moment, theology, the one that we decided to drop in, I think, the 1980s, in quite a significant and in many ways sort of anti-historical decision for the college. And then finally classics. And I mentioned classics last as a discipline, an academic discipline, a pedagogic discipline, because, of course, in some ways, classics is the last to have become a discipline. Before the disciplines in the university, there was Lit Hum and Greats. And Greats was what a version of that is what undergraduates read. Ancient languages, Greek and Roman, ancient literature, ancient history, ancient philosophy. Quite a broad degree through the classics, as it were, but not so much, but precisely as a broad degree. And that was the Oxford education until the second half of the 19th century. In other words, the education the women's colleges have offered for the whole of their history has been a disciplinary education. That's the modern university education. That education is, of course, underpinned by schooling, by a school system which is organized, especially at the higher levels, through disciplines and still prepares school students for A-levels, even AS levels, but they're in a number of disciplines, of subjects that are distinct, are academically distinct as disciplines. And this has meant, of course, that we can accept people and accept as undergraduates those who are prepared in disciplines. In several subjects, it means that the interviews have always been and remain exercises in having a discussion about a historical problem. In the case of history, of course, history always depends on knowledge, and what we do in the interview, what we continue to do, is talk to the candidates about a historical problem. The kind of conversation that many of them have never had before in the way we conduct it. That's what makes the interview process so much, I think, so feared from the outside and disliked. People don't actually understand what's going on, but the school system allows us to do that. Other subjects, of course, differ. PPE, law, don't generally have a school basis to work on. Nevertheless, there's been a disciplinary preparation at school, and it's a preparation that carries on into the disciplines here at university, at Oxford. We do have, or Oxford has, joint degrees. Cambridge doesn't in the same way. Oxford does have PPE, I remember being told at school by Sir Alec Douglas Hume, who was there to tell us, how to get to the top, as it were, and he told us, he said, well, I'm afraid I was just a great failure. I couldn't do greats. I had to do PPE. And in some sense, I think that probably is where PPE came from and explains the curious combination, as it were, that Oxford has, though it works very well at undergraduate level. But later we developed in the 1970s, really, and not until then, a series of joint degrees. In history's case, history has joint degrees with English, modern languages, economics, and eventually, and quite successfully, with politics. But the thing about these joint degrees is that they're not really interdisciplinary. Undergraduates are doing some history and some English literature, or some French. They're doing a chunk of the syllabus. In the case of a modern language, it's often a whole, because modern languages are taken jointly anyway, reading French and German. So if you're reading history in German, you're doing the German that you would be doing if you were doing fully modern languages. But still, you're doing two disciplines. Now, of course, interdisciplinarity is now much in vogue. We're all supposed to be interdisciplinary. It's what the research councils talk about. I think it follows from the natural sciences, where the boundaries of the disciplines are much less well defined historically and have shifted. Conceptually, they've shifted over time. And somehow the humanities are supposed to follow this, because that's what the sciences are doing. It comes down to that to a considerable extent. But the humanities have remained quite resistant to that sort of interdisciplinarity, and for good reasons, I think. Disciplines came into being for good intellectual and pedagogic reasons that we often forget. Sometimes it's age, just longevity of the subject and its teaching. History, after all, is as old as Herodotus, as a literary genre, as a way of organizing thought. Been taught in universities from the 19th century as a discipline. Law, taught through Roman law from the beginning, as it were, taught as a discipline. Philosophy, taught in the Greek schools, and then taught in the medieval schools, and precisely taught by the scholastics so that it could be distinct from theology. Theology is the realm of grace, philosophy the realm of nature, including the law of nature that governs human affairs. So these disciplines have a longer history. Literature emerging as a discipline in the 18th century from rhetoric. Actually, English literature emerged in Scottish universities. They were the ones to pioneer the study. But disciplinarity has not existed simply for, as it were, scholarly academic reasons and to reproduce academics and scholars in the discipline, though it does that. It's also existed as a foundation for a public education. And it's worked because it's been a public education. That is, it educates the citizens of this country who receive it, and it educates, and I don't say dare I say it, I say it, it educates an elite. That elite, of course, across the university sector is broadening, and that raises quite interesting social issues, but that's what it does. And that's what it has been designed to do. And you were educated as an elite. A few words about the prospects for this kind of education, partly because it bears on an issue raised by one of you beforehand, that is the future of the humanities. And I think both Liz and Tom will take that point further. Well, clearly, disciplines in the humanities are facing challenges. They face the challenge of numeracy, of whether undergraduates coming out in the humanities disciplines have sufficient numeracy. I remember Sir Michael Scholar, who was permanent secretary at the DTI, saying once about historians, historians are very good at analysis, at organizing material and working it out and working out the argument. They do that very well. What they don't do is count very well. And I thought it was an interesting. I don't know what Dame Helen, what her views on that, though she must be an exception to the rule, if it is a rule, since she was a historian. A second challenge facing us, obviously, is IT skills, and I don't think that's terribly serious because the young can do it. So I don't think the humanities disciplines are threatened by the need for IT skills. The young are doing it even if we are backward. The obvious and greatest threat is, whatever you call it, marketization, consumer demand. And that raises the question, what does society and what do politicians, broadly reflecting what they take to be social demand, what does society think it wants from higher education? Does it want an undergraduate education which is a smorgasbord? Choice, picking up different bits of different disciplines? Or does it really? And the question is always, what do they really think, especially about their class interests, about what are their real interests? And one has to ask that, you always ask that about a Tory government. And these people, after all, have continued to send their children to the kinds of schools, independent schools, but also good state schools, which produce a good disciplinary education, which get their children into places like this. And do they really want to change that? Well, we don't know, but that is also, I think, a question. What's clear, at least to my mind, is that we will need to defend the disciplines, and we will need to defend them not simply as vested interests, which of course we are. We'll need to defend them because we think they are, both in academic, scholarly, and also in pedagogic terms, very good things. Good ways of learning, of knowing, good trainings for life. Okay.
Right, if anyone wanted to know how we came up with the order of presentations, I insisted that I go after John, because yet again I didn't want him correcting my history, which is, as a good believer in PPE, is always a bit on the ragged edges. I've been asked to talk about St. Hughs in the 1980s, that magic decade of transformation, when men started to enter the college, but also to talk about being, yes, an American in Oxford, because I am American. To my core, I am American. And that really leads me to take a sort of different approach and a challenging approach to John's sort of history of disciplinary education at the university level. And so because I am an American, and because it's sort of, as I sort of arrived at the doorstep unaccompanied in St. Hughs in sort of the summer of 1982, I think let me just step back and give you some background. I'm an East Coast girl. I'm from middle-class background. For an American, to be middle class is the definition of heaven. It is what Americans aspire to. And so therefore I find it very difficult sometimes to talk in the political arena of we're going to squeeze the middle classes, damn those middle classes. To be middle class to an American, and I think this is important as we discuss globalization of the universities and the scope of humanities education in a global university environment, which St. Hughs is a part of, to understand that the approach to class in the intellectual elite in countries is different. To be a middle class in America is good. Okay? The second thing is to understand sort of the formation of Americans of my generation. Now, of course, I'm only that much younger than President Obama is, so this may be a little bit instructive to you. I was born in 1963. Most people, when they talk about 1963, talk about where they were when Kennedy was shot. Well, I haven't a clue. Okay? But I can tell you the formative date of people of my generation, which is where were you when Martin Luther King was assassinated? That is the issue for my generation. And I can tell you where I was. I was with my grandmother. I was in Deal, New Jersey. It was about 2 miles from Asbury Park, where there were very serious riots. My mother was with my sick brother in Baltimore, where there were big riots, because he was at Johns Hopkins University, which was founded to be the hospital in the slums of Baltimore. And my father was at home with the remaining 3 children in Wappingers Falls, which is just outside Poughkeepsie. Again, a sort of place of big riots. And so that is the formative historical memory of my youth. The second memory of my youth, of course, because I grew up in the 1970s, is how America came to cope with the Vietnam War. Okay? And that sort of 1972 Watergate, 1979, the failed invasion of the rescue of the hostages in Iran, were sort of the formative historical times. 1976, the bicentennial. Come 1980, Reagan's elected president in the US, and America becomes comfortable with being middle class and having a conservative government. It's a sort of time when everyone is looking just for a little bit of peace and quiet. Okay? Very different. Margaret Thatcher's elected in 1979. England is not comfortable with conservatism. It is a very dynamic, I would say dynamite time for politics in the UK. How does this figure for somebody arriving at Oxford? Well, it takes a little bit to understand that. Where I came from university, I think is informative. I actually went to university at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Now, Johns Hopkins is known to be a very elite scientific university. Johns Hopkins took the view towards the 1970s into the 1980s, and a view that it continues, that you cannot be a good scientist. You cannot be a good scientist without understanding the humanities. By the same token, it took the view that you cannot read politics, history, or any other humanities discipline without being knowledgeable and without being to speak in the areas of science. So as undergraduates, we were required to go outside, if you like, the humanities field and do science as an undergraduate. I, fortunately, only had to do 12 credits when I was there, and I could graduate with only 12 credits. By the time I'd left, it was 25. So you could see that increase, even at the time I was there, of making sure that those who could speak and learn in the humanities could speak in other disciplines. Very different approach from the disciplinary nature of the Oxford education. The other thing about Johns Hopkins, and this is funny, as I approached St. Hughs in 1982, it was Johns Hopkins only admitted women in 1970. It's one of the last elite universities to admit women. It had admitted women into the medical school in the 1920s, but not as undergraduates. And so I was a fantastic thing to tick the boxes. That probably is the only way I got in. I was a woman, and I wanted to read humanities. But that's very different. I showed up at university when, at the time, there were probably 2.5 women to every 7.5 men. I would tell you most of those women, unlike the women I would encounter when I came to St. Hughs, were scientists. They came to Johns Hopkins, they were reading very, very hardcore, very scary science. So there wasn't, when I came to St. Hughs, my best friend was an engineer and she was the only one. I mean, there were just gazillion chemists roaming the streets of Baltimore. It was a very different background. Now, in terms of my personal approach to St. Hughs, this all sounds very intellectual. There were a couple other dates that are important in here. 1979, Charles and Diana get married. 1981, Brideshead, is this series comes on ITV, and that's quickly spreads to America. And I can tell you, when I showed up at St. Hugh's on that lovely rainy Saturday afternoon, it was Brideshead. It was, and never forget the amazing wonder of arriving in Oxford. And I did arrive at St. Hugh's incredibly happy. Of course, St. Hugh's in those days, you wouldn't know you'd arrived at St. Hugh's because there was never any door that said St. Hugh's College, so times have changed. But it was to arrive in St. Hugh's actually with that American background, which actually made me fit in a very peculiar way. Americans don't, and I, as an American, I wouldn't have understood class. Okay, so I had no class prejudices. Everyone was my friend, everyone wanted to be my friend. And you found if you treated people like that, they treated you back. You could be an anomaly. It was a fantastic place to be an anomaly in St. Hugh's. The other thing about St. Hugh's is I was a bit of an anomaly because I was Catholic. And I found as an American, where we have a very clear separation of state and church, to come to an institution that had any sort of Catholic foundation, very peculiar indeed, and I loved it. And so I became a chapel warden. I thought the chapel in St. Hugh's was a magic place as a youngster to develop a spiritual life. Now, this was an anomaly. And it still remains, I think, a challenge for education, that there is a separate way that Catholics and Church of England and other religious schools grow up in this country, where they don't actually encourage children to actually attend other services. So I would go to St. Aloysius on Sunday morning, and I'd go to the college chapel Sunday evening, and I was very lovingly known as the papist. I did love my candles. So to this sort of very different approach to being a student in St. Hugh's, I'll add one other thing, one great reminiscence, which I wanted when I did PP for a year. I wanted to do sort of modern British politics and government. Now, at the time, you couldn't actually find many politics fellows who were willing to teach that paper. So I remember now, it is true, my husband saying, "You can't do that paper because I can't find anyone to teach it. The only person I can find to teach it is a historian." And that was, of course, the great Colin Matthew, and off to him I went. And I do have one sort of my over-abiding challenge as I talk to youngsters and interview youngsters who've graduated from Oxford and graduated from this college, is a gentle reminder that there is only one guy called Aristotle. Okay? There was only one guy. There isn't an Aristotle for historians and an Aristotle for politics and an Aristotle for law. It's all one book, okay? And I would encourage a challenge to John's interdisciplinary nature, not as a challenge to the humanities, because I think the humanities are important, but to a challenge to the humanities to have greater dialogue within its disciplines and to cooperate within its disciplines. And that really is a very different perspective on what St. Hugh's was to me, because it actually allowed me to take that American tradition to Oxford, and it was a fantastically rewarding time.
Good morning, everybody. I was going to talk about two things, but to leave us some time for questions, I think I'll pass over the first of them, which was to have been. I'll tell you what it was going to have been. That looking out over this constituency, it might not have been entirely inappropriate, the gender imbalance in senior levels in the university. Maybe that's something that we can come back to in questions. Instead, I'm going to take up something that John was talking about at the end, the greatest challenge immediately facing the humanities now. Our teaching grant from central government has been reduced to zero. That's the true scandal of recent higher education news, and one that the newspapers have talked far too little about. All the noise has been about the fees and the fee levels and so on, as if it was the bad universities who were putting up their fees. But that, of course, has followed directly from this not saving or not gentle reduction of the teaching grant, but the abolition of the teaching grant to humanities altogether. The implication that flows from that is that what we do is worthless to society. It may be of value, of dubious monetary value, to the individuals solely who study humanities, but it's not of worth to society at large. I don't think any of us believe that. I hope none of us believe that. I'm a modern linguist, and when I look across to Europe, as I inevitably do, I'm despairing at what seems to be the unique Philistinism of our ruling classes. I don't just mean the present bunch, but they're bad enough. Albeit many of them studied arts and social sciences subjects at Oxford and Cambridge, they recall all too easily 18th century landed gentry who disdain education, would send their sons into the army for a while perhaps, but not to university. I was in Germany recently, in Marbach at the German Literary Archive, the National German Literary Archive, for a joint celebration with the Bodleian of the joint acquisition of by those two institutions of some Kafka manuscripts. The event in Germany was a grand one, and it was reported in all the newspapers. And amongst the VIP guests, how could it be otherwise in Germany, was the Minister for Culture and a large number of his team. In October, there will be a belated parallel event here in Oxford, again to celebrate the acquisition of those Kafka manuscripts by the Bodleian and the German Literary Archive. Do you think we should send an invitation to Jeremy Hunt, PPE Magdalen? What is he? He's our Secretary of State for Culture, Media, Sport and Tourism. Or his junior minister, perhaps, Ed Vasey, whose responsibilities are the arts. Hurrah! Telecoms. It's an extraordinary category confusion. Officially, his responsibilities are arts, telecoms, broadband, digital switchover. It's as if he was the minister for everything you can buy at Dixon's. Oh, and the arts. We can see where their priorities lie. What are we to do about this? How can we resist the pressure? You may think this is going to segue into an appeal for funds. It isn't. Of course, we may need a war chest, but that's not the point. What we need to do is make the argument, as John said. We need to get out there, not just in the college, not just in the university, but in society at large, and make the argument for the value of our disciplines. And we shouldn't underestimate what you bring to us by taking your experience of studying the humanities out into your many professions and telling people what it has meant to you. I don't want to get too pathetic, but we do know that the study of literature, the arts, history, philosophy, the study of humankind enriches our lives, helps us to lead, to experience our humanity more fully. To live better in a better society. We need to bring people to have that experience with us. We need to educate people to recognize that experience. And above all, perhaps after what I've said about our political class, we need to bring on people who at least remember that they once had that experience themselves. Thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you all. This is the stage at which I'd like to open up for a little bit of discussion. We have a roving microphone somewhere? Yes? Oh, thanks. Would anyone like to ask the first question or make the first comment? Yes, thanks. Could you pop? If you just wait for the microphone, then we'll be able to get the recording as well.
Hello, I'm really just responding to John's challenge. I'm Helen Ghosh. I'm a civil servant. There are a number of distinguished civil servants here. Wave your hands. I met people coming in. Hello. So please comment, and Priscilla too. I'm Helen Kirkby, 1973 Modern History. I just wanted to say a bit about, in a sense, why I think the humanities education I had is valuable to me as a civil servant and now head of a government department. I think there are two things that really strike me about what has been valuable, and I feel more and more like a historian as the years go by. The one, I think the crucial thing about policy making in government is what is the problem we're trying to solve. And so many things that go wrong in government are when politicians come in with a solution to the problem that doesn't actually exist. And that ability for us as civil servants to just absolutely think in a disciplined way and take politicians back to the what is the actual problem you're trying to solve, rather than the problem that the Daily Mail has presented to you, and therefore what are the variety of solutions, I think is fantastically valuable. I think in finding solutions, you do indeed, and John raised the issue of Michael Scholar, and are we as humanities graduates sufficiently numerate, you then need to know a man who knows the answer, a woman increasingly in the civil service who knows the answer to the question. So you do indeed need to be interdisciplinary in every sense when you come to discuss what the answer is. And I think that's one of the delights of my life, that I live in a world which is full of scientists who know about climate change and now criminologists who know about why crime happens, and that is one of the reasons I find my career so rewarding. I think the other reason that history is fantastically relevant to what we do in government is having an understanding of the complexity of why things happen and why things change. So very often people say, well, we want to change society's attitudes to, drinking and driving or climate change indeed, or whatever it may be, and they just don't understand why society changes in certain ways, and therefore the variety of ways we have to get, the variety of things we have to do to change people's attitudes and culture and behaviour for the future. It isn't just a matter of changing the legislation and society changes. So I think a historical perspective really helps you understand why and how things change, and therefore all the various instruments you need to use to achieve policy objectives for the future. So I just rejoice in the fact that I'm a historian, despite Michael Scholar's criticism of us as humanitarians. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Anyone else? Yes, down here, please. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Margaret Holbrook, 1963.
Would you mind speaking to the microphone? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. All right?
Yeah.
I've got a word to say about history and the internet. In my teaching of students, both English and American, I'm increasingly worried about how they know what they know, and do they know where it comes from. And the internet, of course, is a wonderful opportunity, but at the same time, it's a bit of a danger. And if you ask them to footnote things, they say, oh, well, it was on a website, but then I moved through to another, and through the link, and I don't know actually where this bit came from. Of course, with American students, I have to say, it used to be, where did you get that from? Oh, it was in a book. Oh, well, which book was that? Oh, well, one of the books on the book list. And to get them to know where the information comes from was bad enough back in the 80s. But now, it's got infinitely worse. And I think, really, we need to be better with the internet than we think we do, so that we can be ahead of them, or at least keep pace with them, as they surf Wikipedia and all the wonderful digitized sources available to them, and insist that they know where what they know comes from.
I think that's really, really important. As I sort of supervise people working on memos for me in terms of taking positions on contracts or taking positions on legal proceedings, if I have one more young associate bring me what I could have found on the net faster than they could, I will get very, very cross. The reason for books is that you find that bit of information that will put you one up on your adversary. It makes you clever, it makes you slicker, it makes you actually see the problem in a whole different perspective. I have been very known to drop breadcrumbs from Temple to Chancery Lane, where the Law Society has a fantastic library. And anyone who brings me a piece of research who cannot show that they've stepped foot in the Law Society library goes back. And I don't care what time of night it is. So they can sit on the steps till it opens. It's a very, very important thing of training and educated minds is to send people off to the library.
I'm glad to hear that. Thanks very much. We've got a question back there. Oh, sorry, we've got...
Sorry.
Do first and then there and then one at the front.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mavanwi Lloyd, modern history, end of the 80s. John was one of my tutors. This is a bit of a cheat, but I did want to go back to ask the question about gender and how the gender balance in the college and how the gender balance in subjects is going to be affected. I was here in the second year mixed, and since that point it's become a male-dominated college at both senior and undergraduate levels, as far as I'm aware. So I just wanted to raise that question because I think it's an important one for how the college looks forward.
Well, maybe I should respond briefly because I was going to say something about that. I arrived in 1990, so that the college was already fully mixed at undergraduate level. My first year of finalists, modern languages being a 4-year course, were the first year that was mixed. And they were aware of their pioneering role. I wasn't. I came from a mixed college to a mixed college. And there didn't seem in that respect to be very much difference. Where the difference lay was in the senior common room. It was a huge difference and a very beneficial one, not perhaps just because of the gender of that dominated St Hughs in those days, but also because of those particular personalities. I came from a very stuffy, closed, illiberal college. I can't remember which one it was. And it was a huge relief to come here. And a lot of the mood and atmosphere was down to those redoubtable women. As Mavanwi says, since then, the college is now dominated increasingly by smart young men. I'm not young anymore. And I'm not normally smart either. I just scrubbed up for today. And it is a problem. Across the university as a whole, the number of women in senior academic posts is fewer now than it was in the 1970s. This is a pretty scandalous state of affairs. And looking forward, I don't know how to address it, but looking forward, I would hope that St Hughs, because of its history, and the humanities, because this is one of the issues that we talk about in the humanities, would be where we debated the problem, looked for solutions. We've done a little bit already in St Hughs by creating the career development fellowships, which allow a bridge at that career point, which is particularly awkward for women around 30, from doctoral work into more senior academic positions. But it's not enough. We need to do more, and I hope we will be talking in college in future about how to do more.
And it's, of course, a problem that is across not just the senior academic sector, it's across all sectors. It's across the city, it's across the law. I think it's something that is really the challenge of the generation, is how do you make it possible to come back from maternity leave and not be working 24 hours a day in a job and 24 hours a day raising children, because, by the way, there are only 24 hours in a day. And that is the big challenge. And I would encourage you not just to think about it in the context of St Hughs.
I must just say one answer to the question is having a single-sex college.
I don't think it is the answer. I would say it's not the answer, because I came from a college that was mixed, and you would still see the same problem in careers.
Can I just my name's Sonia Pasetta, I'm a history fellow here, and I just wanted to add to something Mavan said. We know each other through the Fawcett Society, amongst other things, so we have our agenda. But I just think it's really important, perhaps, to point out that I am one of two female humanities fellows in this college, and I hope that you're as shocked at that as I am. The percentage of women fellows in this college is 24%. The national average is 40%. And I recommend that you read Laura Schwartz's wonderful history of the college, particularly the last page, where she says, why is it that St Hugh's has had two male principals, which is, this is nothing personal about them at all, it really isn't, and yet Balliol is yet to have a mistress.
I think you wanted to come and... No.
The first female head of an Oxford college did actually come from St Hugh's. So in terms of educating St Hugh's women and raising them to take on the world, I think the job is well done.
Yeah, I know we've got another comment down here.
Yes. Oh, thank you very much. I'm Helen Such. I came up in 1967 from New Zealand as a graduate student to read PPE with senior status, and after 2 terms, although I'd enjoyed it enormously, I switched to a graduate degree in economics. So I'm one of the guilty Philistines around, and I was extremely glad, in fact, to hear the call to arms for the humanities, because I think a very important task we have is to make sure that the Treasury is not dominated by people who are very narrow-minded and who have been only taught economics as one discipline. And I mention this as relevant to what we've heard about interdisciplinarity. And for me, as an economist, I was lucky. I just mentioned a little more of my background because in my first degree, I read a lot of history, and my MA was in pre-Renaissance English language and literature. So I did have a little more idea of the contingency of the subject when I came to economics, and I don't think enough economists do. And there is this great tendency to think it's the revealed truth, especially if economists haven't benefited from some of the great teaching that used to take place here and the history of economic thought. And I did have one of my best, most memorable lectures ever in All Souls on the history of economic thought. So what I guess I'm saying also about interdisciplinarity is meant to put in a word for the importance of PPE in civilizing economists. But when I was here, and I admit I don't know how it's taught now, I enjoyed each separate subject enormously. I had philosophy with Julie Rowntree, and that was sparkling and intellectually stimulating and a lot of fun. I had politics, but I was being taught modern history, and I didn't actually think that was politics as I expected, at least. And, of course, I had economics with Theo Cooper, and she was wonderful, and I always stayed in touch with her. But it did strike me that the course would have been much more powerful and much more humane if those 3 subjects had been taught in a more integrated manner, so that the philosophy and the politics allowed the economists to see how their subject had to be grounded in those disciplines. If they were lucky enough to have history as well, I agree that was even better. So I do think that there is an instrument in the hands of the college. It may take a long time to come to fruition, but I think the mission of civilizing economists is one that you can do through PPE.
Thank you. There's a question over here, or a comment.
Yes, I want to raise particularly the last point that you were making. I'm Diana Webster, 1949, and English, not history. To me, the burning overall question of today here in England, and I'll say why I say in England at the moment, is the question of the attitude, the sidelining, the dying out possibly of the humanities and what we can possibly do to help. Now, this is not only in Britain, can I say. My history is, as I still live in Finland, where I have been a lecturer in English language and literature at the university. The recent developments there are that the government is forcing the Helsinki University to have half its governing body taken from outside the university, i.e. from the business world. This means that the money in future is not going to the humanities, as here, but is going to the sciences, the technologies in particular, which will affect and get graduates to work for the businesses. I want to also add an anecdote. I came up here on a long train journey, and the man next to me I was speaking to, and he was in his 30s. He did not have a job. It turned out he had studied engineering, but he was talking about the impossibility of studying today. And he's in England, and he said to me, at the moment, if I was having an interview, I would be asking what they could do for me. I want to interview them. I want to say, what have you got in the future for me in the way of a job? Where are the people you're going to recommend me to when I've finished to help me get a job, And it's the papers. And I would like, how can we possibly help? I did my bit. I argued with him about the meaning of university training. But how can we, here, individuals, what can we do to try to help and rid people in general of the idea that you go to a university simply to get a paper for a job? Thank you.
Can do. I think as I interview people for jobs in the law, I think it's important that you realise that we are looking for degrees across the spectrum. There is no handicap in getting a job in business from having a humanities degree. And that is, I can tell you that, and that's really important to consider.
Liz, can I give just a couple more to the left? Yeah. There was someone, yes, sorry, you've been waiting an awful long time. We'll take one more. Then I think we
Thank you. I'm Caroline Pestio, History, 1958. I think John Hopkins can do it, but I don't think many other people can, and I'd like to give a really bad example. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. We have 4,000 students at the undergraduate level in international development. None of them have to do any history, none of them have to do any geography, none of them have to do any politics. I would take a bet that only one out of the 4,000 knows what the Treaty of Berlin was about, knows what the unequal treaties in China were about, and these people are going to be launched into society to do international development. I mean, heaven help them and us. I think that the interdisciplinarity should come at the graduate level. But the earlier speaker who said that it was a pity that the three parts of PPE weren't more integrated, I would challenge you and say that's up to you to have integrated them in your further studies or in your life. I don't think it's up to the lecturers to do the integration. I strongly believe in the disciplinary level of education at the undergraduate level, and then you do something else and you integrate it. But looking at the people that I'm in contact with at the University of Ottawa, 4,000 undergraduates with virtually no disciplinary learning.
Right, thank you. I think this really will need to be the last one, but could you bring the mic over? Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy James, Geography, 1959. On this question of humanities and social sciences, perhaps I could just top up what's been said already that touches on social sciences specifically, as distinct perhaps from humanities with its very disciplinary base. After geography, which I had chosen to read here from a small grammar school in Westmoreland, as it was then, I chose geography. I could have gone to English or maths from my A-level results. I chose geography because it was open. It kept all questions open, and I was interested in travel and doing something academically in the world in the way of fieldwork. After my degree, I became a graduate student in anthropology. And in those days, anthropology was completely postgraduate field in this university. After teaching various parts of the world, I was appointed back here. I retired just 3 years ago from teaching anthropology, but not only at the graduate level, where there was this attempt to bring disciplines together in the way that students were brought in as graduates from a variety of disciplines. But since I was appointed here, various new degrees came on the scene that were seen, certainly in the case of human sciences, which began in 1971 or thereabouts. Human sciences was seen as a new kind of PPE, which included science. But it was a degree that has been extremely successful. This college has made a great contribution to fostering human science as a degree among the students. And the other degree, which came in about 1990, was archaeology and anthropology, where again there is, I think, a very successful attempt to bring together disciplinary perspectives on shared problems in the history of humanity. So that I think on the social science side we can we can raise a little flag and say we have done our best to get best of both worlds.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we'd better leave it there. I hope that the discussion will go on in the queue for lunch and throughout the rest of the weekend. Just like to thank again our panel for their contributions and all of you as well for adding such interesting comments and questions to our discussion. Thank you all.